Sweet. All right. So I sent out the email and kind of gave you a mini intro, but Jason, are you down to give kind of where you are right now, why you chose the specific paper, and then we can just kind of roll right into it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my name is Jason Tuori. I'm a sports PT, just finishing up a sports residency at University of Rochester Medical Center. I've been in clinical practice since 2017. Also do some run coaching and strength and conditioning coaching. Primary area of interest is in endurance athletes and runners. That's kind of the short bio. So for why I picked this paper, I think this was one that came out a couple months ago and made the rounds on social media, and it was interesting because it kind of, from like face value, you look at the abstract and it tells you something that you probably didn't expect based on popular opinion. But then there were also a couple components that I wanted to dig a little deeper into, so I thought it'd be nice to do that. So you want me to just roll right into it, Chris?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So I actually, well, I'll kind of give like the whole formality of this paper is called and all that stuff. Um, so this is by the author is Au, I think the pronunciation would be, et al. Ton of authors on here. Important thing to note here: Roy Chung, who is probably the senior researcher on this paper. He's done a lot of research in foot strike patterns, footwear, motion control footwear in the past. So this is definitely in his wheelhouse of things that they've been investigating for a long time. So the title of the paper here, as I pull it up, comparison of impact sound across rear foot, midfoot, and forefoot strike during overground running. And the kind of background on this is we classically think that when you hear a loud impact sound with somebody running, that's associated with higher load metrics. So those load metrics, actually, I want to share my screen real quick here because pulling up a picture just makes a lot more sense than me drawing a curve with my fingers. Let me go ahead and do that 1 second. Impact, and the average and the instantaneous of the slope is basically this line right here. So when we impact the ground, in this little mitten shaped force curve is from someone who rear foot strikes. So from a rear foot strike, we'd see this initial impact and then peak. And then what we would also see is an active peak, which is going to be halfway through the gait cycle. The active peak is where the most peak forces are. This is mid stance. This part, the impact peak, happens right after initial contact. Now, these are just basic, like impact peak and active peak are how much force is happening. What this paper is actually looking at are more the loading rates. So how fast is the force happening? And that's averaged from 20% to 80% through the initial impact here. The reason a lot of researchers have tried to look at this is because there's some stuff a while back out of Ari Davis's group that showed that runners with higher loading rates had higher incidence of bone stress injuries. There have been conflicting findings on that, so that's not a universal finding in the running literature. So this idea of like the faster the loading rate, the more injurious that type of running might be, is something that's been investigated for a while. And I think, oh, well, if that is the case, and then if we change somebody to not have as much of a loading rate, then we could try to prevent those things, would be the line of thinking there. So most of what this paper is looking at is just the loading rate here, not the actual amount of force from the impact peak, and not anything about the vertical ground reaction force impact peak. And the reason that's important is because when you look at the final conclusion in this paper, where it's, well, these sounds and these foot strikes are not associated with loading rates, It's actually, they only investigated the rate. We don't know if they were associated with impact peaks or active peaks. So we can only make the inference based on, all right, those things, the sound and these foot strike patterns didn't necessarily, the rate is not something that we can particularly care about then. The other important thing that I wanted to scoot over here while my screen is shared is, again, the difference between what a rear foot strike and what a forefoot strike vertical ground reaction force curve looks like. So the mitten shape is from the rear foot strike. Typically, it does have a higher loading rate. So the acceleration is quicker here compared to a forefoot strike, but they both end up having the same amount of impact of active peak. So that can be changed in a number of ways. It could be sometimes a forefoot striker could have a higher impact peak. Sometimes a rear foot striker could, depending on some other parts of their running mechanics. So what's kind of in question here then is like, all right, if this part right here, the total load during mid stance is what actually matters, then what we're investigating over here is not going to, it's not going to tell us anything. If this is the part that does matter, then investigating the differences between rear foot strike and forefoot strike are valid. So that's a valid way to go. So that's, I think, a relevant background into talking about the article here. And let me unshare now. All right, so had a couple notes here just on some of their background through the paper. So it's commonly thought, again, that rear foot strike is associated with a louder sound and increased impact variables. The assumption is that we're interested in these impact variables. For some other background on this, Fan et al. In 2017 instructed runners to run quietly, and that did reduce peak impact sound, peak loading rates, and vertical ground reaction force. That said, we don't know that when you cue somebody to run quietly, a lot of different things happen also. So, and that's another kind of recurring theme with this paper too, is when you ask someone to run quietly, it doesn't necessarily mean that you changed their foot strike. You probably changed a lot of things all at once. This paper tries to just investigate the isolated effects of foot strike by not cueing them verbally and just having them do different types of foot strikes. Chan in 2018 found that in a one-year prospective study of novice runners who were cued to run softly, those novice runners who were cued to run softly went on to develop fewer injuries. Again, the mechanisms of that were not known, and they didn't do a pre and post gait analysis on them. So this idea that if you run quieter, there's going to be an injury prevention effect, or the assumption that there's going to be some sort of loading metric that decreases, there's a lot of variables that go into it. So that's kind of the background here. Can we think of any other confounders? So when you think about impact sounds change based on foot strike, what are some other confounders we can think of that might change impact sound?
Surface, or like surface you're running on, or your shoes.
Yeah, so somebody's footwear. So in this study, they standardized footwear. Everyone wore the same shoe, but you could also say that the disadvantage with that is that now you have an individual running in a shoe that they are not accustomed to, and that might not be the normal gait mechanic for that individual. Surface, they also pointed out as one of their limitations was they were doing this over ground. This probably doesn't generalize to treadmill running, where you're going to also hear mechanical sounds on the treadmill. And where do we do most of our gait analyses? We do them on the treadmill. So that's kind of a tough, clinically, what do I do with this side of the paper? Any other confounders we can think of as far as what might change impact sounds?
Body weight?
Or even just within the same individual.
Oh.
Just their whole lower kinetic chain. You tell me to run forefoot versus rear foot, and my lineup of all my bones is going to change, right? I mean, everything. And then my pace changes. I know that changes for me, right? And are we changing stride length? What all these other things would have to be symmetrical for that to actually matter? And
yeah. So the thing I think I thought of immediately was stride length. Because they tried to standardize pace by saying you're going to run 3.5 meters per second plus or minus 5%. But somebody could run at 160 steps per second with a very long step length, or they could run at 180 steps per second with very short step length. And they could have a 4-foot and a 4-foot in both of those conditions. And the vertical ground reaction force would be different for those two. The braking forces would also be different for those two as well. So that's a pretty big confounder and something that was not controlled for in this study also. All right, so as far as background goes, before we get into methods, any questions on kind of like the overall context of why are we doing this? All right, let's get to it then. So this is a cross-sectional within subject lab study. Their inclusion criteria were a minimum of 15 kilometers per week for greater than 6 months. A lot of these inclusion criteria for running studies are kind of arbitrary and just based on the convenient sampling of getting recreational runners into a lab. So this has been a kind of long-standing issue for a while, is defining like what's the definition of a recreational runner. So that's, you kind of have to draw the line somewhere. So, all right, they were running habitually 15K a week for greater than 6 months. They were excluded if they ever had lower extremity surgery or had a running related injury within 6 weeks. That's probably reasonable. You could make the case maybe to actually push the running related injury thing quite a bit further back, maybe like 6 months, 6 to 12 months, because gait mechanics can still be different in recently injured runners compared to the runners that haven't been injured in a while. That was a study that came out of, I'm blanking on the author's name, but a study that came out of Ireland last year. So 30 runners, 15 male, 15 female, average age in the like 23 and a half, pretty standard recreational runners, we'll say. So they used force plate, motion capture system, and the microphone setup. These were all used. The setup that they've done have all been used in previous studies. So they basically just repeated the protocols of a lot of things that have been done in the past. Their standardized shoe. So I was very, very unfamiliar with this shoe. This is not a popular ASICS shoe. And even in trying to search for some of the properties of the shoe, I couldn't find anything on it. So I don't know why they ended up going with this one, but it's a 330 gram shoe. It seems like it's kind of like a neutral trainer. So your standard like control shoe for a lot of running type studies. Maybe they picked it because nobody wears it, so everyone would be unfamiliar with it. Yeah, I'd be surprised if that was the habitual running shoe for any of these runners. So everybody wore the same shoe. They sized them out, so it was appropriately sized for them, but they controlled for the shoe condition. And we know that does matter. So if you're in a minimalist shoe, you're more likely to land closer to mid and forefoot. If you're in a very high stack shoe, you're more likely to land closer to a rear foot. They standardized speed, as we said, so 3.5 meters per second plus or minus 5%. So that's a range between 3.325 and 3.625 or 675 meters per second. They had to have 10 trials per strike pattern with 30 seconds rest in between each trial. So that was 30 total trials with 30 seconds rest in this run up of 20, I think it was 20 yards, was it? Something like that. So
20 meters.
Yeah, 20 meters. Yeah. So pretty kind of like standard lab run up. Yeah, so they had enough then where they basically saw like, all right, if there was significant variance here, then we're gonna average these out anyway. And one of the questions I guess I had here, we kind of alluded to this already, but how might all of this change if shoes and running speed were self-selected?
What do you mean how much it changed? Like how might the
Yeah.
sound change or the
Yeah, I guess what other things would they have to control for if they just let speed and shoes be self-selected? And I guess how might that affect some of the results too?
I'd assume with shoes, you have to know how much sponginess, what like actually test against things, the variable shoes, and see what the standard rate of noise difference between those, and regress back to a mean from there. And for pace, you have to figure out what the pace differentials would be and regress back to a mean. And everything has to have these extra steps of statistics to be able to find a normative curve for those, because you're on normal samples now. And that's beyond my statistics knowledge, and I don't like to think that hard. It hurts. So.
Yeah, it would be a total pain in the ass. It would make the study more applicable to real life, but it would be a huge barrier, a huge statistical barrier. So realistically, we know that in changing a shoe, it is going to alter somebody's foot strike, and that's probably going to alter the sound that they make with the environment, the different types of properties in the shoe. Self-selected running speed is actually one that's probably more commonly used in a lot of studies looking at normal biomechanics, because if you tell, one of the things we could say that's a downside of standardizing speed is that some of these runners were probably going faster or slower than their preferred pace. And so then is the noise that they make actually a valid, does that represent what would actually be happening for them? Probably not. But you have to pick one way or the other with these types of things.
So in their conclusions, they would really have to state at this speed.
Yeah.
On this surface with this shoe, this is what matters.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Which makes the finding a lot less exciting and less likely to get accepted.
I have a question.
All right. Oh yeah.
So maybe this will be like a wrap up that you were going to talk about, but my understanding is that this is looking at kind of like you said, like these initial vertical loading rates compared to these 3 foot strikes. Why does sound matter? Because they're using that 20 meter like data from the board or whatever it's called underneath it. Why sound and not just like the data itself?
Because sound is something you can do in the clinic, and you don't have the data in the clinic. Say you're doing a gait analysis in the clinic, you can hear the sound, but you can't see the curve unless you have an instrumented treadmill. So their idea is, if the sound represents the same thing as the slope of that curve, then we can have this clinically applicable thing that you don't need $30,000 treadmill for, and clinicians can start to use this right away to infer the louder the sound, the higher the impact slope.
Isn't that already part of the inference though? I mean, that's sound is one of the things you're taught to listen to, right?
It is
the analysis. So we already have that bias built in. They're just trying to confirm that.
Exactly. They're basically saying we're making this assumption that sound equals higher loading rates. Let's test this so that when we keep doing this in the clinic, we're not basically changing something under a false assumption. So that's it. And they didn't really get that much into like that part as the purpose of their study. They actually kind of fluffed around with a few other things, like we can do this to alter training load and like give advice based on training and injury prevention. But I actually thought the first thing is like, oh, you can use this if that is the case, you can use sound appropriately instead of getting metrics.
But then I have to go run on the surface that they ran on in the shoe.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. We need the gel.
Yeah,
we need the gel feather, and we need a run up, and no more treadmills. Yeah. So, right. So that would basically be the purpose here. So finishing up methods here, they basically kind of set the guidelines of a rear foot strike is going to be greater than an 8-degree inclination angle. So dorsiflexion inclination angle when you hit the ground. Midfoot strike is going to be anywhere between 8 degrees and negative 1.6. So from about level to 8 degrees. And then forefoot strike is greater than a negative 1.6 degree decline, or 1.6 degrees of plantar flexion. These have already been standardized or defined in previous literature. They normalized them to body weight. They also investigated, so they were looking at max sound amplitude. They also looked at sound duration and median frequency or pitch, just because those things haven't been investigated before. I don't really know if if that's a thing that we can do clinically anyway, like, oh, the sound was a little longer here, or the pitch was a little higher, but they were probably throwing those in as this hasn't been done before, so let's do this. What I really liked about this, and what I think every paper should do, is release individual participant data. So that was actually also one of the reasons that I picked this article, because I automatically appreciate when an article shows individual participant data, so that you don't just get the averages of all of the groups. You can actually see how each participant responded in each different condition. And as we roll right into the results here, pretty much across the board, in terms of peak sound amplitude, rear foot strike was the lowest. Midfoot strike was generally the highest, but in some runners, the forefoot strike was the highest too, looking at the individual participant data. So that's actually then the opposite of what we'd commonly think. So we commonly would think this like heavy rear foot strike, it's going to make a lot of noise, and it's going to lead to this very fast loading rate. Midfoot strike was the highest in these conditions. And it was also the highest in the frequency, so the pitch sound. And then for sound duration, the rear foot strike was the longest. And in those two areas, I don't really have much to comment on, because I don't particularly see much plausibility of how those things matter. So, right, there were no significant relationships between sound characteristics and running kinetics. And that, I think, was a big one. That was probably the big headline that was shared around when this paper came out too. So sound was not associated with these running kinetics. What I think was probably overshared when this article was popularly shared was they had running kinetics written out, but we really have to specify they just looked at loading rates. They didn't look at impact peaks. They didn't look at active peaks. So for all we know, those things might have been associated with the actual absolute value of force. So if somebody makes a really loud sound, maybe that is associated with higher impact peak and higher vertical ground reaction force. We don't know based on this paper. So we actually can't say that it's not associated with any of those things. It's just not associated with loading rates.
Do we know if those peaks are associated, not just the rate of force, but actual those same peaks with increased incidence of bone injury or other injury rates?
So it's a question, are the absolute value of like impact peak and active
Correct.
peak associated?
Right, because they're just looking at rate in this.
Right.
So
the thought, and I don't think this has been investigated yet, but I know Rich Willie's group is looking at active peaks for a lot of other things right now. The thought is that the active peak is the thing that really matters, because it's the absolute value of force that then the body has to contract the calf to pull on the tibia. And so this paper by Emily Matchevich a couple of years ago was the one where we like saw the force of the vertical ground reaction force and then the force of the muscle pulling on the bone. And the muscle pulling on the bone was like all of the bone. It was like 8 times as much bone force. And so we're just like, oh, maybe it's this. Maybe that's the reason, because the muscle's pulling really hard on the bone. As far as impact peak itself, I think it's conflicting, because you also see there's no difference in bone stress injury incidence with forefoot strike and rear foot strike, and forefoot strike doesn't technically have an impact peak. It just has this, whatever you want to call it, shaped curve.
This is somewhat off topic, but like at the intro, they talk about the kind of proportion of runners or the differential between the three groups. And it's way, what is it, like 80+% that are rear foot strike?
Yeah.
Why do people naturally adopt that the most frequently?
That's a good question. I think that's more of a philosophical question. um, I think you could make the case, and the case has often been made, that more cushioned footwear have allowed rear foot striking to be a more comfortable form of running. So it's kind of like this comfort filter or comfort paradigm moving through the path of least resistance. If you've got cushion underneath your heel, you're now no longer like, oh, I don't want to land hard on my heel. That's uncomfortable. Because there have been some studies that show that going from shod to unshod, you switch to closer to a midfoot or forefoot strike. Not all of them are conclusive on that. Actually, there was a study on habitual unshod runners in, this was a Dan Lieberman study. It was somewhere in Kenya, I believe, where one of the groups actually was the opposite. They were just running barefoot, like rear foot striking, and they've always been doing that. So that was one of those like, oh, maybe it's not just about shoes. Yeah, I have to think from a motor control standpoint, it's just this is the path of least resistance. This is the most economical way for me to move. We know that when you change what your habitual strike pattern is, if you go from rear foot to forefoot, your running economy worsens acutely. You might then make it back eventually, but your cost of running increases when you switch from rear foot to forefoot strike. If you switch from forefoot strike to rear foot strike, so if you're a habitual forefoot striker and switch to rear foot strike, your running economy does not worsen as much. So it changes a little bit, but in the studies that have investigated that, it's statistically insignificant. So yeah, I don't.
Studies of marathoners, and they actually change kind of their foot strike throughout the marathon.
Throughout the course of it. So that again would kind of lead you towards this is probably the doing what's most economical at the time type filter.
Hey, Jason, I have a question.
Sure.
I think the one thing that I'm struggling with, like with this paper, is more like, how can we actually apply this clinically? Because it sounds like, I mean, as Paul and all of you have kind of mentioned, like in order for us to apply this to most of our clinics, like we would have to essentially standardize everything that they did with the exact same shoe, running surface, things like that. But most of us are utilizing like a treadmill for gait analysis, allowing them to use their own shoes. Like they're probably either picking their own pace, or even if you're trying to pick a pace, it's probably not going to be either too above or too below like their threshold.
Yeah.
So like, I guess at this point, like what would you take from this paper? And let's say come Monday, would you be like, I can start potentially applying this to my runners and maybe making a difference with them?
Yeah, I think if we strictly interpret any article, then we fail to apply it to the clinic. So we have to make some jumps and some assumptions for anything to be useful. I see this article more as one of those like I'm free type things rather than I've got a new tool to use. So I no longer need to think that sound is a proxy for impact loading variables. So if I think that I need to change someone's loading rates, I'm not going to use sound as the target variable of interest by saying land a little bit softer or run a little quieter because I think we need to decrease the sound that you're making. Now we can cue somebody to run quieter and it could decrease their loading rates, but it is probably not because they decreased the sound of running.
Now, we also have to take literature kind of in context. This would be kind of a proof of concept study, right?
Yeah.
And then if it showed, then we broaden it out with more loose constraints, and then we're able to kind of do that, right? So we always have to recognize that some studies are just basically, is this even conceptually with the most constraints valid? And then we can broaden it out. And really, we could still say that in this condition, they didn't prove, they were unable to disprove the null hypothesis, right? But we could say that with individual stride lengths in their own shoes on a treadmill, maybe it still is valid. We don't have that study. So we have to have a broader context of what the literature is, and understand where things fall within those parameters.
Yeah. And kind of off of that, one of the things I often think of is like, if something really had a massive effect, we would see it over and over consistently. We wouldn't see it be conflicting. One say this, one say that, one say this, one say that. So even if it is a thing, it probably has such a small effect that it might not even be clinically meaningful. So it's more of a one less thing to worry about type paper to me.
Is there, so okay, there, I feel like there's a lot of things that you don't need to worry about. What about the bucket of things that you can or potentially could alter that could have an impact on either performance or reducing the risk of injury? Is it just like, I know stride length or cadence has kind of been talked about. Is there anything else?
Yeah, that is pretty much the main one I gravitate towards, and that's because it's the only one that I think can carry over given feedback while they're doing it. So at this stage, the thing that I do most is if somebody has a running cadence in the 160s or below, which is kind of on the lower end, running cadence would be the same as a step rate. So 160 steps per minute. And they're either recovering from a bone stress injury, they've had bone stress injuries in the past. That's kind of like the main category of injuries. Maybe patellofemoral pain also, we could throw in that bucket, where I'm thinking, if I change their cadence a little bit, 5 to 10% an increase at the same running speed, then per stride, they're taking on less load. And the thing that matters there is that it's less vertical ground reaction force per stride. I, at this stage, don't really think that loading rates are a thing that we need to keep chasing. To me, there's been too much inconclusive evidence on it that it goes back to if this was the thing that really mattered, this was the target variable, I think we would see this consistently in every single bone stress study, and we haven't. It is much more plausible to me that it's just the total amount of force going through the leg that has to resist against the ground that's contributing to some of these injuries. Which of course you can talk about training load too, because that's the thing that mostly matters. But from a running cadence standpoint, the reason I still gravitate towards it is because from a motor retraining standpoint, you can have somebody's watch beep at them and tell them, keep this number or I'm going to keep beeping at you. Because I fail to see how it's actually successful to carry over otherwise. You can do it on a treadmill, they can run the same speed and then increase their cadence and it's perfect. And then they get over ground and they just start running faster if they keep their cadence up, or they just kind of fall back into their habitual cadence. So they need some sort of feedback, and then it should be faded over time for it to become a new motor skill. That's kind of where I'm at with that. But
that new cadence, let's say you alter it or you increase cadence, is there a point where is that just like their new norm going forward? Do you ever try to revert back to a slower cadence?
If somebody feels better with it, then I'll say, consider keep doing that, like continuing to do that then. And if they're like, this is awkward, it's not working for me, then we just scrap it. Or if it's this helps with my symptoms, but then they end up just kind of going back to running how they were before, I'm not going to push the issue if they've recovered.
There are a few studies that show like after 2 years, most people regress back to a more familiar cadence or somewhere in between.
There's actually the longest follow-up has only been 6 months in a cadence retraining study. Yeah, and at the 6 month mark, it can still be the same, but I would bet that 2 years, 5 years out, unless somebody continues to practice it and continues to focus on it, then it's probably going to just go back to
I have those that run with music, specifically get to like the beats per minute type stuff in the music to help with the cadence. It just carries over, and that way they're training at that pace.
Right. So they have a constant amount of feedback.
Right.
The issue there that I've run into is then sometimes you got to set an alert to
If they're going
put
too
an
fast.
upper pace
Yeah.
alert on it
Yeah.
so that they don't just end up running faster, which
Right.
happens a lot of the time, which then defeats the purpose of increasing running cadence. Because as you run faster, more load per stride.
Yeah.
So if you're changing running cadence, it's easy to change, or it's easier to change that if they're at like 8 minute per mile pace. But let's say they have different runs where it says their longer run, they're at a slower mileage. Are you alternating each just like mile pace based off of their run for that day, of like this is going to be a 10% decrease, or what, 10% increase in cadence no matter, you know what I'm trying to
Yeah, so that's a good question. Most of the time, I do the retraining at their easy pace. So the
Okay.
pace that you spend most of your week at, which for a lot of runners is greater than 80% of their weekly volume, they're going to be spending at this pace, and we're going to just notch the cadence up a little bit. As you go into tempo runs, mile race pace, sprinting, your cadence is going to increase until it basically gets to a point where it levels off. As you approach sprinting, basically your cadence levels off, and then stride length is kind of then the limiting factor of how much faster you're going. There's a little bit of an interplay there. In some individuals, one will increase before the other does, but usually it's one of those things that as you start to get into faster speeds, it's pretty rare that I would do cadence retraining at that point. But yeah, it's largely a load management strategy for when you're doing the bulk of your training.
Do you see that you use that for like insertional, not insertional, but mid tendon for the Achilles as well?
Achilles.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know about the ankle. I actually could very well see increasing cadence as something that either doesn't work or puts a little bit more stress on the.
Right.
So the original Heiderscheit study in 2011 showed that decrease at the knee and decrease at the hip that we're all familiar with, but the ankle increased a little bit. So it actually increases work at the ankle. So then it's a question of, is that tendon sore because of more increased work? Or if we increase cadence, we're going to decrease the overall vertical ground reaction force anyway. Does it end up making it more comfortable? So I usually actually do demo it out anyway and see if it helps. Especially if somebody's at the lower end of the structure, the spectrum. If they're already in the 170s, I'm probably not going to try it too much, because going from 172 to 178 doesn't make as much of a difference usually.
I have a question. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I could be wrong on this. I'm curious if you know this. If you ask runners to run at their self-selected pace, generally, whether that's too fast or too slow, but the pace that they self-select for most runs, is that the pace they're most economical at?
That's a good question, because most runners are probably training a little faster than they should for most of their weekly volume. But then if they're spending most of their time at that pace, it means that they're practiced at that pace, which means they're more economical at that pace. But then if they ran slower, they'd be able to use less energy. So there are a few different moving parts that might make that question a yes or a no, I guess.
Yeah, but my understanding, like similar to what you were just saying, right? The more you train at a certain pace, the more economical you become. And I'm not sure if this is true either. I assume the same would be true with cadence, right? If you bump someone's cadence up to around 180, but their self-selected cadence used to be, 165, the more time they start to spend at that newer cadence, they become more economical.
Yes, that is true.
I guess the next question related to that is, with the vertical impact forces, do we know if you're running at a better running economy, does the impact force change? Like, say you've always been a heel striker. Does that perhaps mean that your vertical impact forces might be lower because that's your economical pace? And if you're asked to switch to midfoot or forefoot, it then increases the vertical impact force?
Are we specifically talking about impact force or vertical ground reaction force? So the impact peak or the active peak?
I guess the impact peak.
Peak.
Yeah, I don't know.
I would think the impact peak is going to be highly variable based on step length. So further out you're going to strike in front of your body, the higher that impact peak is going to go. But that's also going to mean more muscle demand, which is going to increase the metabolic cost of running. So we could probably say, like, I'm not sure which one's causative or just correlated, but if somebody is pretty economical, they probably land a little bit closer to their body. Cost of running decreases. And as they're landing a little bit closer to their body, that impact peak is probably a little bit lower, which is then there's less muscular demand to counteract those forces. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I guess.
So I don't know if it's a causative or it's just like, yeah, these things all go together in the same bucket.
Yeah. And I thought that was interesting about the study where, you know, I might have missed it. I don't know if they explained like what each person's self-selected foot strike was.
They didn't assess it. That was probably a pretty big limitation.
Sure. I wonder if any of the data would be different or the conclusions would be different if you looked at each participant and saw maybe where they were loudest. Maybe it was a pattern that they're unfamiliar with.
I think that's probably one of the main things. And they didn't assess what habitual strike patterns was. So we can assume most of them were rear foot strikers just based on prevalence. Sure. Whenever you ask somebody to do something different, it's a grab bag. So it's like they're learning a new movement. They're probably less economical. Maybe they're reaching a little bit to make sure they got onto the force plate, which is going to increase sound and increase the impact forces also. It's tough to say.
Yeah, good stuff. Thank you.
Yeah.
What about, is there an association between impact sound and increased fatigue as you go throughout like a run or a race?
Yeah, I don't know that that's been investigated, but it makes sense that it would.
There is fatigue, for sure.
Yeah. It's anecdotally, I can say I've seen it. Yeah. At that point, it's like the throw your body through space and hope that you just keep bouncing along type thing. So that was a good part about the limitations here. So habitual strike was not identified. We kind of talked about the treadmill generalizability, whether or not we can actually use this on a treadmill. I think at the end of the day, you probably could. It would just be harder to tell because you'd be doing it on the same treadmill. It would just be harder to actually tell the differences in decibels because treadmills are naturally louder than force plates over ground anyway. Any other limitations that folks picked up on that we haven't already beaten down?
I don't think they mentioned it, but would a limitation be just that 20 meter, length? Does that change?
I get for 3.5 meters per second, probably not, because as long as they were able to get up to that pace and hold it for a few strides, they'd probably be getting what they need to. One of the things I thought of was they had to land on the plate, which if you've ever been involved in a lab study like that, you definitely change up your stride as you're getting closer to it to make sure that you step on it. And that could actually just be a huge compounder for some of the data. So I think the overall conclusion, they tried to fluff up their conclusion a little bit, and I just kind of ignored half of that. But the midfoot strike was louder than the forefoot strike and rear foot strike here. So contrary to what we would expect. Sounds were not associated with impact rates. So going back to what we're using in the clinic, we might still think that sound is associated with higher forces. We don't know yet. And I wish that they had also just looked at that. But you look at a bunch of different things and then the study's underpowered. So I have to compliment them for only looking at a couple things. Yeah, there's something to be said about the study that does that.
Research is hard.
Yeah, definitely. They had one thing they wanted to look at. They had a couple of other secondary outcomes, and that's a good paper in my book. Some of their the what do we do with this? Their conclusion, their background is a little fluffy, but I'll give them a pass on that too. It gave us something like stepwise paper to basically challenge some of the assumptions that we make with gait analyses. We just have to be careful to not overgeneralize their findings, which is this is about loading rates, not about peak forces. That's, I think, the kind of the final conclusion for me is peak forces might still be out there somewhere. And it is dependent on a lot of different things. It's not all about foot strike. Maybe sound is a part of that. If you do hear someone landing really loud, they also might still benefit from a cue of land a little quieter. It just might not be the sound that's the variable that we're looking for, or the loading rates for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, we're using sound as a proxy, so it may not be the
Exactly.
proxy for the loading rate, but it may be a proxy for something else. We just are unsure what that is at this point.
Exactly. Yeah. Any other open thoughts on this one?
What would the next step, like, would you want to see another paper progressed from this one, or would you just want to look at the sound with peak?
I wouldn't mind if they just redid this whole thing with peak impact and then peak active peaks.
You think much would change findings wise?
Hard to say. I think there's a chance that the sound would be associated with peak vertical ground reaction force, but we don't know. Yeah, I think despite some of the limitations we talked about in setup, I think it's one of those, like, they standardized, they standardized shoes, they standardized the run up, the pace that they were running, the individuals. You did the best you could from a lab standpoint. Just repeat the same design and look at the two other things.
But I'd still like it to see it on a treadmill where they're not having to reach for a force plate. So we're not getting an artificial slap where they're trying to hit the ground or making sure they're pushing into the force plate. Right. And then because you could summate the background noise. We do it for surface EMGs and things. There's ways to take that noise out of it. And then we could possibly actually have something that also is extrapolative to the clinic when we're doing that within. But
and I don't want to assume that all of those trials were garbage trials either. Like they could have all just looked like runners running over ground. But yeah, it's one of those things we don't know.
Well, if you've done it, if you've ever fudged with force plates, you know that you make sure that you're trying to hit the
it's hard to
kind of get in the middle because you don't want to be off the end. I mean, there's some things that just change just because you're being studied with that force plate. It really
especially
does,
if you have to do it 30 times with 30 seconds rest in between.
So there's some realities that we know. If you played with them, there are some things. So
I wish most of these papers just had like a video or two of showing the thing, so you could at least like picture it in your head or a picture of it. So
that's the future.
That's a great point. Why don't we have more multimedia research?
I've seen a few video abstracts.
Here's what this looks like. Here's what there'd be ways to do that and make it to where we could be much more immersive within actual studies. Although again, now I have not only are you a participant, but are you willing to be on camera? We start getting into all kinds of other, again, making research that much harder, but it would be great to have some of that. Even if it was just lower leg, can I show just your foot and ankle? I mean, that would be nice to see.
There was there was one I saw that was like a video, had like, I think it had like some hop tests on it or something, just the videos of the people doing it, which is nice too, because when like an ACL paper where they say they hop tested somebody, but you don't know what position their arms were in, or if that was even a valid way of doing it too, you can actually see what they did. That's the future. Make it happen.
I had one question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So kind of a thought that keeps running through my head, pun intended, is that, Scott Morrison's quote that he comes back to a lot is that stress is just stress. And so when we start talking about, these peak ground reaction forces and total force and peaks, I think I would be more apt to have discussions about expectations and load management before I would be changing shoes, running style, and trying to like work on the sound that they're hearing. And not that that's a bad thing. I just think that I'd be more inclined to go with load management and that kind of thing just as an entry point, but I could certainly be wrong. And I'd just like to have maybe a little bit of a discussion about that in your experience. Could you speak to that?
Yes, the main reason why that's tough is because runners would rather not run less and run the same amount, but run in a way that's putting less force into their legs per stride from a symptom. If we're talking about in rehab where we're doing symptom modification, they would rather run the same amount, if not more, with a modification than run less the same way that they've been running in the past. That's kind of the trump card for all of it. It's what they want. But I largely agree with you. It's the body adapts to stress. There's some ceiling that's an upper limit. Now, say you're working with a runner who's had 12 stress fractures in the past, then I'm probably more apt to mess around with how much force is going per stride. I think then it's a little bit more valuable. Obviously, the load management is still key for that individual as well. But at that stage where they've tried a lot of different things, then you start to fall back into the, okay, what else can we try here to keep you going? But yeah, I think it's the body adapts to stress. Most runners don't have a great training plan anyway. But at the end of the day, they can be a tough breed to work with.
Yeah, no, thanks, man. That is super helpful and a really, really good perspective. So appreciate that. The other thing that I was thinking is who's winning the race? I mean, if you're talking about competitors, and then, you mentioned earlier that changing to that 4-foot strike tends to make things a little bit less advantageous biomechanically, potentially. Maybe this is more applicable to just the recreational runner who's running for the love of the run, which I have no freaking understanding of
who's
at
that?
all.
That's crazy.
But yeah, those psychos out there that do that. I'm kidding. If you're like that, please continue. But I would also be more concerned about, like, from a competitive standpoint, like, well, who's winning though? Like, who's going faster? Because that's at the end of the day, like, I just want to win.
Yeah, and this was a discussion that I had him mobilize like a couple months ago too about 4-foot strike, where the distance of the race makes a big difference too. So we think about distance running is from the 800 meters up to ultra marathon. The closer you are towards that ultra marathon, the more you're going to see rear foot strikers, because it ends up being just the most economical thing after a while. But you're almost never going to see an 800-meter runner on their heels, especially the way that a track spike is designed. So footwear comes into play there too. But even if you put some 800-meter runners into a neutral shoe, they're still going to be on their toes as they're going at that speed. So the speed of running is going to play a part. The footwear is going to play a part. We're in an era now with footwear like we've never seen before. It has these massive stacks underneath it. It's never been easier to be a rear foot striker. The consequences are as low as they've ever been. So some of that is it's multifactorial, but you do see like some professional runners who are very prominent 4-foot strikers, but for the most part, it's like a mild 4-foot to mid-foot ish maybe, and then as somebody's maybe doing like easy runs, they'll be at more of a rear foot strike or longer distances. The pros, the very competitive runners, can change their foot strike they're pretty malleable in that way. Recreational runners might have fewer movement options.
That's a huge point. Just being able to like traverse that spectrum, being able to change based on the demands of the speed or, pace around you. You get in these tight pockets with people that you got to keep pace with, or then other times where you can kind of lay off the gas a little. So that's a really interesting point. Thanks again, dude.
Yeah, absolutely.
All the stuff out there. Really appreciate you guys coming on these things.
Yeah, thanks for the questions.
Now, let's talk about the reality of these people were only 130 pounds on average.
Yeah, they were a little lighter, I'd say, than the average.
I mean, but if we're talking recreational runners,
right?
At least in the United States, that's not who's coming in as the rec runner for me, right?
Well, this was Hong Kong, right? So
just saying, it looked a little light for me.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think they averaged the weight of males and females too. So I kind of in my head just like added 10 or 15 pounds to the males and subtracted 10 or 15 pounds from the
See,
average.
I used to race in the Clydesdale division, and what's funny was they would make that a 185, and I was still 245 at the time. And at 285, what am I now? I mean, is there bigger than the Clydesdale? Because my ass
See.
ain't running against none of those little guys.
The Iron Clydesdale.
I have a bigger picture. Well, just a question about running. So if you had someone come in, just general population, who's never really ran before, and you're seeing them run for the first time, do you say much at all? Or do you just
yeah.
do you just say like, okay, let's slowly bump up, this treadmill, and are you giving any cues? Are you saying anything like, what does that look like for someone who hasn't really adopted a technique over years and they're just starting?
Yeah, novice runner. That's a big point of contention. There are camps that believe that everyone should practice distance running form as a skill, and then there are camps that's your form is the reflection of you moving through space at the most economical, best energetic cost. There are novice runners, so they're slightly more likely to develop a running related injury, but we could probably also say that a big reason for that is they don't really know what's reasonable and what's not from a training standpoint. They might then be more apt to get some of these like too much too soon type injuries. I largely don't think that the novice runner's form is the reason why they would get an injury. So if I saw something that I thought was excessively not economical, and then we changed it and it felt better for them. So let's say they're doing like huge bounding for whatever reason, and we increased their cadence a little bit and they just felt a little lighter on their feet, a little bit better. That might be something that I play around with. I also like to know what somebody's injury history is too. That's usually a pretty big one for me. If somebody's had chronic patellofemoral pain or a history of bone stress injuries, I'm probably going to be a little closer to the maybe I do want to intervene and increase their cadence a little bit if it's on the very low end, but largely I'm pretty hands off. It's kind of the same way with my coaching also. Unless I feel something needs to really be changed here and this feels good and it looks good to them, then I'm kind of okay with them figuring it out, because their form is going to change a little bit anyway as they go. Everything is not economical when you start doing it. Is over coaching at the start what needs to happen, or is their body figuring it out what needs to happen? I don't know.
We tend to forget that self-organization takes time, right? We need lots of reps and lots of kind of self-feedback and all that other kind of stuff going on. And if we throw in our own feedback within that, it's real hard for that body, and we may actually prolong that time frame for them to figure out what is for them, right? So
yeah, I even noticed this like at the start of a new training block, as anecdote alert. If I'll take a couple weeks off in between seasons, and then when I start just a general base training block, I feel inefficient. My body is just, I haven't been consistently running. I've been kind of just doing my own thing for a couple weeks, and I get back on a plan, and I just feel like sluggish, and my form doesn't feel right. And then like 4 weeks later, I click in and I feel fluid again. So I mean, how much of that is then just the neurological practice of getting back into the routine of doing something?
Would you say that for a novice runner, one of your bigger education points is getting them to run more slowly? Because I find that when I talk to newer runners, or even people that have been running for a while and are just in that injury cycle, oftentimes, they're running at faster than 5K race pace a couple times a week. And I feel like that type of education seems to go a lot further than the biomechanical stuff.
Absolutely. This is, I would even extend it to experienced runners to make the same error of training at faster paces than they should on a regular basis, because there's no additional benefit of, we'll say, training at your easy pace compared to training at easy plus on a given day. You're going to get to the same endpoint. You're just putting more stress on your body for no apparent reason. The other thing for the novice runner that I usually like to emphasize is like, you know, they took however many years off of sports and they're getting back into a run program or something. I think everyone underestimates the demands of running on their body, because they think like, oh, I played soccer when I was younger, like I can go out and do a 5K every couple of days after having not done that in a long time. I really emphasize that like this is in the early stages more about getting your muscles and joints used to this type of thing again, used to getting back into loading, more so than cardio, I'm out of breath exercise. So treat it that way first. And then once your body is in routine with these things after a longer block, then can start to get into running faster from there. Because I think and that even goes for the experienced runner too. Start a block where you're just working on base before going into some of the faster stuff, so that you're not just shocking your body back into overload.
Yeah, but base is boring. I want to go fast.
And that's why running has the highest incidence of injury, because doing it right is boring. Absolutely.
So this is another off the paper question. If you're training a runner and like they're your own athlete and then they're not like coming for rehab and they already have like a running coach, when you're setting out like a weekly or monthly schedule, do you plan runs based off of like the mileage, or do you base it off of like, I want you to run a 30-minute run at this RPE or this pace? Like, how do you?
Yeah, so from a coaching standpoint, I do usually gravitate towards minutes unless somebody has like a real affinity for, I am obsessed with mileage. And then I'll just say, okay, well, fine, 4 miles. And it being in the ballpark of like what time I was otherwise going to prescribe them to run anyway. Well, I guess I'll use one of my clients right now as an example. He's an 800-meter runner. He's big into mileage, so I've converted to miles for him. But for some of my others, I'll just do a block of like, today's going to be an easy run, whatever, 25 to 35-minute range. And most of my clients will know like easy is just don't even pay attention to the pace. Just go out and it should feel subjectively easy. I like to not prescribe a number of RPE from a prescription standpoint, because then they have it in their head as like, yes, this is a 3, as opposed to just that's easy. And then afterwards, if you want to put a number down in the box there, tell me how it actually felt. Because I've struggled with that too, of like seeing like, okay, well, I want to hit a 6 or 7 for this tempo run today, and then no matter how I felt, it's like, yeah, that was a 6 or 7, and then it defeats the purpose of using RPE. Yeah, I find that time is just kind of better in general, because your cardiovascular system really doesn't care how far you traveled. It cares how long it was working and at what intensity. So from like a TRIMP is like the training load impulse, basically this measure of area under the curve of your heart rate. So heart rate by time, that I think is like from a cardiovascular training standpoint, pretty interesting stuff. And given like how much work somebody is doing, and it doesn't have anything to do with distance.
I'll add one thing there, just in my experience to your point, and the point about people running too fast. I think a lot of the time, if you tell someone to run 5 miles, generally, I feel like they're trying to get it over with quickly. You know, they know they have the 1 mile left, and then they're gonna like kick it. Versus if you're out for 30 minutes, you're out for 30 minutes. So you're
Doesn't
gonna
matter.
might as well
Yeah.
make it an easy run, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. And then occasionally I will kind of say, like, if I see that somebody who I'm coaching is running too fast for their easy runs, just like tone it down. take a little bit off the top.
Jason, are you familiar with Nathan's crazy thing he just did a while ago? Nathan Henderson.
Yeah, I'm not sure I am.
Nathan,
what
please
crazy
tell me.
thing did you do, Nathan?
Oh, I was about 6 or 7 weeks ago now. So I was coached by Zach Robinson with Gauger and Strength, and then Mike Amato handled my running. I did a powerlifting meet on a Saturday, tried to do a marathon. The race directors cut it down to 20 miles on Sunday. And then the following Saturday, I did a 50-mile ultra marathon.
That is indeed crazy.
Was a bear chasing you? I mean, I don't understand the need to run that far.
Wow.
The need was to get this cool mug.
Okay.
How much of the 50 miler did you run and how much did you just like walk?
Oh, I had never run anything that close to that far before, so I probably walked. I think I finished in like 11 and a half hours, so I was probably walking 3 to 4 of it.
Yeah,
I'm not a competitive runner for it, but
the ultra marathon running is just its own different beast. Like that you got to have a passion for being in the woods for a long period of time.
I already think runners, like distance runners, are pathologic, but ultra people, I mean, that's a very, very weird pathology within the the pathologic group.
Yeah, and it's funny because I can empathize with them in some rights. So I'm a middle distance runner, and I'm very much towards like the mile and 800 meter end of the spectrum, where my focus is on like taking a second off of my time or 2 seconds off my time, which is a stupid arbitrary goal. And then you get to like, okay, I'm going to add an hour to my time. I'm going to add 2 more hours. You're just extending the thing in the opposite direction. It's very fascinating. But geez, yeah, I mean, real crazy stuff.
All right. I think that's a good spot to end. Jason, thanks for coming on and chatting. I know I think the first time I messaged you was probably like, I don't know, 10 months ago.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was a
Your life
crazy
is
time.
chaotic.
It is. Yeah. This is like the first Saturday I've been able to chill in so long. And I love talking about running. So what a good way to do it.
Perfect. Solid. Yeah, thanks again, man. Next week we have very different topic. Nicole Piemonte is coming on to talk about death and dying. So that'll be fun, about her new book. If anyone hasn't bought it, I'd recommend it. It's pretty legit. It's just kind of morbid. But yeah, thank you all again for joining the party. And Kevin, were you gonna say something? You're unmuted.
I was just gonna say thanks to Jason.
Yeah.
That was informative.
Yeah, thank you all for having me and sticking around for the good questions.
Dope. All right, y'all enjoy the rest of your weekend, and hopefully I'll see you next week. Bye.
Take care.